Get out now. This is a restricted emergency facility for trained professionals only, not random people who think they can just walk into 911 dispatch centers. Leave before I call security to remove you. The vicious dismissal exploded through the 911 emergency center as Operations Director Derek Collins aggressively blocked the black woman from the dispatch area. He gestured authoritatively at her civilian clothes with emergency superiority. Completely unaware, he was ejecting Marcus Response, the CEO whose $245.6 billion emergency empire owned every ambulance, fire truck, police dispatch system, and 911 center in America. Let me take you back to 3:45 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon in downtown Chicago, where assumptions about authority would cost someone their career and revolutionize the entire emergency response system forever. Marcus Response had built her empire one emergency call at a time. At 48, she was the founder and CEO of Response Global Systems, a comprehensive emergency services conglomerate that had revolutionized crisis response and life-saving operations across North America. Her company owned and operated emergency dispatch systems in 127 major cities, manufactured 84% of all emergency vehicles, and managed the technology infrastructure that connected 911 calls to first responders. From the ambulances that rushed to medical emergencies to the fire trucks that battled blazes, from the police dispatch systems that coordinated law enforcement to the helicopters that conducted rescue operations, Marcus controlled the infrastructure that stood between citizens and catastrophe. But her vision extended far beyond profit margins and response times. Marcus had transformed emergency services from fragmented local operations into a coordinated national network that could respond to any crisis with unprecedented speed and effectiveness. Her companies had invested $47.8 billion in developing next-generation emergency technology, implementing AI-powered dispatch systems that reduced response times by 43%, and creating training programs that had elevated the professional standards of first responders nationwide. Most importantly, she had pioneered the concept of universal emergency access, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of location or economic status, had the same level of life-saving emergency response. Her systems had eliminated the disparities that once left rural and low-income communities with inadequate emergency services. Today's visit to the Chicago Emergency Communication Center wasn't planned. Marcus had been attending a meeting with FEMA officials about national emergency preparedness when she received an alert about a major incident response in the city. Rather than monitor the situation remotely, she decided to visit the communication center to observe her systems in action during a real crisis. She dressed for her federal meeting, a simple navy business suit, comfortable shoes suitable for potentially visiting emergency scenes, and a basic handbag containing her credentials. To anyone watching, she looked like a concerned citizen or perhaps a government administrator checking on emergency operations. It was the perfect test of whether the Chicago Emergency Communications Center was maintaining the standards of professionalism and accessibility that Response Global required from all partner facilities. The Chicago Emergency Communications Center occupied a secure facility in the downtown area, serving as the nerve center for all emergency response in the metropolitan region. The facility processed over 5,000 emergency calls daily, coordinating responses from police, fire, and medical services across the greater Chicago area. The center featured state-of-the-art technology that Marcus's companies had designed and installed: advanced computer-aided dispatch systems, real-time GPS tracking of emergency vehicles, and sophisticated communication networks that allowed seamless coordination between different emergency services. The main operations floor contained dozens of dispatch stations, each equipped with multiple monitors displaying maps, vehicle locations, and incident information. During major incidents, the center became a hub of controlled intensity, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death.
Every dispatcher was trained to handle multiple simultaneous emergencies while maintaining the calm professionalism that emergency situations demanded. As Marcus approached the facility's main entrance at 3:45 p.m., she noticed the heightened activity that indicated a significant ongoing incident. Emergency vehicles were moving throughout the city, and the center's personnel were clearly managing a complex multi-agency response. She presented her identification to the security guard and explained that she was there to observe emergency operations as part of a federal assessment. Her credentials, which identified her as a consultant to FEMA and other federal agencies, should have granted her access to observe non-sensitive operations. However, within minutes of entering the facility, she encountered Derek Collins, the operations director, who had been watching her approach the dispatch floor with obvious suspicion and territorial concern. "Excuse me," Derek said, approaching Marcus with the aggressive confidence of someone who believed he controlled access to sacred emergency operations. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." "I understand," Marcus replied professionally. "I have federal credentials for emergency facility assessment. I'm here to observe operations during the current incident response." Derek examined her identification with obvious skepticism, as if looking for reasons to deny access despite the clearly valid federal authorization. "This says consultant, but our protocols require advanced coordination for any federal visits. I'm conducting a routine assessment of emergency response capabilities," Marcus explained calmly. The protocols allowed for unannounced federal inspections during active incidents to evaluate real-world performance. Derek's suspicion was clearly growing. "Ma'am, this is an active emergency scene with multiple ongoing incidents. We can't have unauthorized civilians wandering around the communications center during crisis operations." The word civilians hit Marcus with particular irony, given that she had dedicated her entire career to emergency services and employed more emergency professionals than any other organization in the country. "I have proper authorization," Marcus said, showing her credentials again. "I'm here to assess how well the center is managing the current response." Derek's frustration was becoming obvious. "Look, I don't care what your paperwork says. I'm responsible for the security and integrity of this facility. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. And you've determined I don't belong based on 20 years of experience in emergency services," Derek replied, his voice rising. "I can spot someone who doesn't understand emergency operations from a mile away." "Get out now," Derek suddenly exploded, his voice carrying across the dispatch floor. "This is a restricted emergency facility for trained professionals only, not random people who think they can just walk into 911 dispatch centers. Leave before I call security to remove you."
The brutal dismissal fell like a shockwave through the emergency communications center. Several dispatchers paused their work, startled by the aggressive outburst from their supervisor. Other emergency personnel looked up from their stations, clearly uncomfortable with the hostile confrontation occurring during active emergency operations. Marcus felt every eye in the facility watching her, waiting to see how she would respond to being publicly attacked and expelled from an emergency center where lives were literally being saved moment by moment. This was exactly the kind of discrimination that undermined public trust in emergency services. Among the witnesses was Jennifer Martinez, a veteran dispatcher who had been coordinating ambulance responses. She had watched the entire interaction and was shocked by Derek's behavior towards someone with proper federal credentials. "Sir," Jennifer said, stepping away from her station despite the ongoing emergency calls. "She showed you valid federal identification. Federal assessors have the right to observe operations." Derek turned his attention to Jennifer, clearly angry at being challenged by a subordinate during what he viewed as a security situation. "Martinez, get back to your station. I'm handling this security breach." "It's not a security breach. She has proper federal credentials for emergency facility assessment. You're supposed to accommodate federal oversight." Other emergency personnel began murmuring their concerns. Michael Chen, a fire department liaison who worked regularly with the center, approached the group. "Derek, I've seen federal assessors come through before. They usually have this exact type of identification. What's the problem here?"
Martine appreciated the support from the emergency professionals, but she knew the real issue was systemic. This wasn't just one supervisor having a bad day. This was the result of attitudes that treated emergency services as exclusive territories, rather than public services accountable to federal oversight and community access. Martine reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, her movements calm and deliberate, despite the chaos of ongoing emergency operations around them. Derek and the gathering personnel watched her, probably expecting her to call some federal supervisor to complain about access being denied. Instead, Marcus dialed a number she knew by heart. "Sarah, it's Marcus. I need you to conference in legal and Chicago emergency operations immediately. We have a serious discrimination situation at the communications center." Sarah Kim, her chief of operations for 11 years, didn't hesitate. "Connecting now. Legal and emergency management will be on the line in 60 seconds. Marcus held the phone so her voice would carry clearly in the communications center. "Thank you. And Sarah, I need you to pull our operational contracts with Chicago Emergency Services, specifically the federal compliance and access protocols. Already pulling them. Marcus, are you safe?" "I'm safe. But this facility isn't operating according to Response Global's federal compliance standards." Derek and the other emergency personnel had gone very quiet, watching Marcus with growing confusion and concern. The tone and content of her phone call suggested she wasn't just an ordinary federal consultant calling to report an access denial. "Ma'am," Derek said, stepping closer with forced authority that couldn't hide his growing nervousness, "if you have concerns about facility access, you can file a formal complaint through proper federal channels." Marcus looked at him calmly. "The concern, Mr. Collins, is that you've just denied federal oversight access to emergency operations while standing in a communications center that operates using technology my company designed and installed. You've made assumptions about my qualifications while working with dispatch systems that my business built and maintains. And you've done it while representing an emergency facility that operates under contract to Response Global Systems." "Response Global Systems?" Derek asked, his voice uncertain and increasingly alarmed. "That's right." As her phone buzzed with the incoming conference call, "The company that owns and operates the emergency systems that save lives every day."
Marcus answered the phone and immediately put it on speaker, despite the ongoing emergency operations around them. "Good afternoon. This is Marcus Response, CEO of Response Global Systems, calling from the Chicago Emergency Communications Center. I need to report a discrimination incident involving the operations director." The response was immediate and professional, cutting through even the noise of emergency operations. "This is David Rodriguez, General Counsel for Response Global Systems. We're recording this call. Can you describe the incident?" "I entered this facility with proper federal credentials for emergency operations assessment. I was publicly attacked, told I don't understand emergency operations, aggressively ordered to leave, and threatened with security removal by the operations director." "And who was the personnel involved?" David asked. Marcus looked directly at Derek, whose face had gone completely white as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. "Derek Collins, Operations Director." The effect was immediate and devastating. Derek began to understand not just who Marcus was, but what her company controlled. Response Global Systems wasn't just another emergency services contractor. It was the technological and operational foundation that made modern emergency response possible. The computer-aided dispatch system that Derek used to coordinate emergency responses, it was designed and built by Response Global's technology division. The communication networks that connected 911 calls to first responders, installed and maintained by Marcus's companies as part of a comprehensive emergency infrastructure upgrade. The ambulances racing through Chicago streets, the fire trucks responding to emergencies, the police vehicles coordinated through the dispatch system, 84% of all emergency vehicles were manufactured by Response Global's fleet division. When citizens called 911 and received life-saving help, they were experiencing the end result of systems that Marcus had designed, funded, and managed. But the scope went far beyond individual pieces of equipment. Response Global controlled the supply chain that brought emergency technology from laboratories to dispatch centers, the training programs that prepared emergency professionals for crisis response, and the coordination systems that allowed different agencies to work together seamlessly during major incidents. Mr. Collins, do you understand what Response Global Systems does? Derek shook his head, still processing the revelation and its implications for his career in emergency services. We own and operate emergency dispatch systems in 127 major cities. We manufacture 84% of all emergency vehicles nationwide. We employ 89,000 emergency professionals, including many of the people working in this facility. We've invested $47.8 billion in emergency technology that saves lives every day. She gestured around the communications center. Every computer in this facility was designed by my company, the dispatch software, the vehicle tracking systems, the communication networks. All of them exist because Response Global invested in making emergency response faster, more effective, and more equitable for all citizens.
Within 30 minutes of Marcus's phone call, the Chicago Emergency Communications Center had been transformed into the scene of a federal compliance crisis that threatened operational contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Two executives from Response Global had arrived, along with representatives from FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security, who were already in the city for the scheduled meetings. Derek Collins had been escorted from the facility and was meeting with federal investigators at a nearby federal building, trying to comprehend how his discriminatory behavior had potentially compromised national emergency preparedness protocols. Marcus found herself in the center's conference room, getting a briefing on how the incident would be handled and what immediate changes would be implemented across the entire emergency network. "Miss Response," said Lisa Chen, Response Global's VP of Federal Operations, "we are profoundly sorry for what happened today. Mr. Collins's behavior was completely contrary to our values and the federal compliance standards we maintain in all emergency facilities." "Lisa, this wasn't an isolated incident. This was the result of attitudes that treat emergency services as exclusive territories rather than public services accountable to oversight and community access. I need to understand how widespread this problem is across our emergency network." The investigation that followed revealed troubling patterns across multiple Response Global operated facilities. Federal compliance reports showed incidents where legitimate oversight had been denied or obstructed. Emergency operations audits revealed disparities in how different communities received emergency services, with some areas experiencing faster response times and more professional treatment than others. Most concerning of all, there had been 28 formal complaints about access denial and discriminatory treatment across Response Global emergency facilities in the past year. Most had been filed with local emergency management and marked as resolved without any meaningful federal investigation or corrective action. "How did these patterns go undetected?" Marcus asked. "The facilities were meeting their response time targets," Lisa replied uncomfortably. "When operational performance looks good, oversight tends to focus on efficiency metrics rather than compliance with federal access standards or equitable service delivery." Marcus leaned back in her chair. "So we were saving lives efficiently, and that was enough. We failed in our responsibility to ensure that emergency excellence meant emergency excellence for all citizens, with full transparency and federal accountability," Lisa admitted. News of the incident spread quickly through the emergency services and Homeland Security communities. Within hours, federal publications were reporting on the discrimination incident and Response Global's response. Emergency management social networks amplified the story, with many professionals sharing their own experiences of access denial or discriminatory treatment in emergency facilities. But the real impact was felt in emergency services across the country. If Response Global Systems, a company that controlled such a significant portion of emergency infrastructure, was willing to take strong action against discrimination and access denial, other emergency operations needed to examine their own practices and staff behavior. Marcus used the attention to announce a comprehensive federal compliance initiative. Response Global would require all partner emergency facilities to implement bias training for staff, establish federal access standards that prohibited discrimination in emergency facilities, and submit regular reports on equitable service delivery across all communities. Emergency services belong to all citizens equally. We will not tolerate discrimination or access denial in any form, and we will use our position in the emergency services industry to ensure that excellence in crisis response means excellence for every community and full compliance with federal oversight.
Derek Collins never worked in emergency services again. His termination from the Chicago Emergency Communications Center was immediate, and word of the incident spread quickly through the emergency services professional networks. But beyond the career consequences, the incident forced Derek to confront his own biases and assumptions about authority, oversight, and who deserved access to emergency operations. In the weeks that followed, he began to understand how his territorial attitudes had not only hurt other people, but had cost him a career he had worked 20 years to build. He had let assumptions about appearance and authority override his professional training and basic principles of federal compliance and public accountability. The woman he had attacked and expelled controlled an empire worth $245.6 billion and had the power to transform emergency services nationwide. But more importantly, she was a federal official conducting legitimate oversight of public safety operations, and she deserved professional courtesy regardless of her wealth, status, or appearance. Derek eventually found work in a different field, but he never forgot the lesson of that Wednesday afternoon, that emergency services are public services, and no emergency official has the right to deny legitimate oversight based on personal biases or territorial attitudes. 6 months later, the Chicago Emergency Communications Center had become a model for federal compliance and inclusive emergency operations. Under new management protocols and with comprehensive staff training, the facility served all legitimate oversight with full cooperation and maintained transparent operations that welcomed appropriate federal assessment. Marcus made it a point to visit emergency facilities regularly, always unannounced and always in civilian attire suitable for emergency scenes. Each time, she was treated with the professional courtesy required for federal oversight. More importantly, she observed the same respectful, compliant treatment extended to all legitimate federal assessors and community representatives, regardless of their appearance or perceived authority. The changes weren't limited to Chicago. Across the Response Global network, emergency facilities had implemented new training programs and federal compliance standards. Regular compliance audits tested facilities to ensure proper treatment of oversight personnel and equitable service delivery. The International Association of Emergency Managers invited Marcus to speak at their annual conference about building accountable emergency communities. She used that platform to share a simple message. Every emergency call represents someone's worst day. Every citizen deserves the best possible response. And every emergency facility must remain open to the oversight that ensures we're serving everyone equally. For Marcus, the incident represented both a professional challenge and a personal reminder of the work still needed to build truly accountable emergency services. She had built a global empire and controlled billions in emergency infrastructure, but none of that had protected her from being attacked and expelled while conducting legitimate federal oversight. The experience strengthened her resolve to use her position and resources to create systematic change. Response Global established a $300 million foundation focused on emergency equity,
providing advanced emergency services to underserved communities and funding emergency management education programs that emphasized community accountability and federal compliance. Marcus also began speaking more publicly about her experiences as a Black woman in business, sharing the challenges she had faced and the strategies that had helped her build her empire while maintaining commitment to public service. Her story inspired other entrepreneurs and emergency professionals to examine their own assumptions about authority and accountability. The changes at the Chicago facility and throughout the Response Global Network didn't stay contained within emergency services. Other public safety and federal agencies began adopting similar policies, recognizing that transparent operations and oversight compliance weren't just legally required, they were essential for maintaining public trust and effective operations. Law enforcement agencies implemented bias training for personnel. Federal facilities examined their treatment of oversight officials and community representatives. Even private companies that served federal contracts began reviewing how they handled legitimate oversight and assessment activities. Marcus's simple act of conducting federal oversight while Black had exposed systemic problems that extended far beyond emergency services. The response demonstrated that change was possible when people with power and influence demanded accountability consistently and systematically. Chapter 14. The Legacy. 2 years later, Marcus kept a photo from that day on her office desk, not of the confrontation, but of the Response Global Transformation Ceremony, where new federal compliance standards were formally implemented across all emergency facilities. The image showed diverse emergency professionals from all backgrounds working together to serve communities with full transparency and federal accountability. It reminded her every day that business success and public service weren't competing priorities, but complementary goals that strengthened each other and built safer communities. The emergency services industry had learned that excellence meant excellent treatment for all oversight and excellent service for all communities. The lesson, delivered one discriminatory encounter at a time, had changed everything.
Marcus still visited emergency facilities regularly, still dressed in civilian attire, still conducted federal oversight in facilities where personnel sometimes made assumptions about her authority or right to access operations. But now, when those assumptions proved wrong, she had an industry that stood as proof of what happened when you treated every oversight official with respect and maintained full compliance with federal requirements. The emergency services industry learned that transparency wasn't an expensive upgrade, it was standard equipment for public safety. And that lesson, delivered one facility at a time, continued to transform not just emergency operations, but the community's relationship with the services that protected them. The impact of Marcus's experience extended beyond immediate policy changes to influence the fundamental philosophy of emergency services. Cities and communities began to understand that emergency response wasn't just about efficiency, it was about serving all citizens equally while maintaining full accountability to federal oversight and community standards. Emergency management schools began incorporating transparency and equity training into their core curricula. Students learned that effective emergency response required not just technical skills, but also commitment to serving diverse communities and welcoming legitimate oversight. The concept of territorial emergency operations was replaced with community-centered services that recognized emergency facilities as public resources accountable to the citizens they served. Emergency professionals learned that their primary obligation was to the communities they protected, not to maintaining exclusive control over emergency operations. Federal agencies developed stronger oversight protocols and clearer compliance standards. The result was emergency services that were not only more effective, but also more trusted by the diverse communities that depended on them. If this story moved you, remember that every interaction in emergency services is an opportunity to choose accountability over territory. Every citizen deserves equal access to life-saving services, and every assumption we make about authority costs our entire community the transparent and equitable emergency response we all deserve. Because sometimes the most important emergency response isn't to a crisis, it's to injustice. And that's a call that benefits everyone when answered properly. The emergency services industry learned that the greatest emergency of all is losing public trust. And preventing that emergency requires treating every citizen, every oversight official, and every community with the respect and transparency that democracy demands. When emergency services truly serve everyone equally, everyone is safer. And that's the most important life-saving mission of all.